I recently released a time-lapse video of Batman's creation that I sculpted in Blender 2.8. Now you guys had a lot of questions, so I'm making this video in response to that, and I'll be talking a little about the concept, the sculpting, texturing, shading your character in Blender 2.8 EEVEE. Enjoy! I'm Batman! Okay, so I'm going to start with the concept. So first things first, no matter how good you are at sculpting, no matter how confident you are with your sculpting skills, your character design, I always advise people to look up reference. And I'm not saying go follow the reference from A to Z, but look up as many references as possible. For example, through Pinterest, you can create your own board and then just check out Batman from the movie, from the comics, from different artists, and study the design. See how the original design looks like, what makes Batman, well, you know, Batman, and look at how other artists tackled the features and all of the shapes and made their own version without actually breaking the character. Once you absorb and understand the character's design, it's time to start planning ahead. And this is really important. You need to understand, just take a moment and try to decide what kind of look you're going for. So when I did Batman, before I started sculpting, I already imagined the final result. I wanted a mix of the comics, so you can see that from the eyes, and some realism. Now this is a dangerous game that I played, because a mix of stylized character and realism at the same time, there's just a fine line where it could go really wrong. But the fact that I planned ahead and already thought of ways to tackle all of the issues helped me throughout the process, and I ended up getting this result in a short amount of time. Here I'm going to show you some of the things I tackled early on and decided before I started working with Batman, and also how I got the expression that I want. So for example, first things first, because of Batman's mask, he has this really big forehead. In reality, it's the mask that's really big, it's not his forehead, but here, because I have a very stylized character, I actually incorporated it and made it look like it's actually his forehead that's big. And that's quite fine, because when you're stylizing a character, if you understand the forms, the anatomy, you can play around to make it work. Also, for the grumpy and angry look, I played around with the mouth, gave it a bit of a curve, and the eyes as well. Now, when you're working with the eyebrows, always pay attention to keep both of them in harmony. So you should never, for example, let me just do it right here. If you want to put this one down, you shouldn't just suddenly have a cut like that. That would look really weird. It actually has a harmony, it goes that way. Even if, for example, he's happy or surprised, then it's like that. It never breaks. You never have something like this. It's gonna look weird. Okay, so let's start talking about the sculpting itself. Now, since I planned ahead, I knew that I will create the mask from the face itself. So I didn't really have to bother with creating details that I didn't need, such as the ears. So if I hide the eyes over here and the mask as well, this is what the face looks like before I tackled the mask. For the ears, I just added a little bump to indicate that there are ears underneath the mask itself. Now this leads me to how I created the mask. So let me just unhide everything again. The mask over here is just a duplicate of the face itself, and then I sculpted these parts over here to get the shape. To show you a quick example, we have a sphere over here. Let's imagine this is the actual face. You can just duplicate it with Shift D, Tab to go to edit mode, and then Alt S to scale it outwards a bit, just a bit, which is basically the thickness of the mask. Once you're done, you will sculpt the duplicate of the sphere or the face if you're sculpting the face. So you can go to sculpt mode and then use whichever brush you would like, for example, the crease brush, to push the shape inwards. And that way you can actually get whatever you want. So this gives you a good idea of how I did the mask. Once you're done with that, you can actually go to the sides over here, and with the crease brush or any other brush, for example, the pinch one, you can use the control button to have the opposite effect of what the crease brush does, and go over the edges over here to push them outwards. And once you're done, you can go to the pinch brush over here and then pinch the edges to get a sharp look, just like the one we have with Batman over here. As for the Bat logo, it's actually quite simple and fun to do. So if I grab it over here and move it around, you'll notice that it sticks to the body of Batman. Now this is done basically with the shrink wrap modifier, but let me break it down for you. So if I go to edit mode over here, you'll notice that it's just a bunch of vertices without even any thickness. So what I did is I did half of it, so I don't have to bother with both. I added a mirror modifier, so if I move this, this is what it looks like. I also added a shrink wrap modifier over here, so if I remove it, this is what it looks like without it. Once I add it, it sticks to the body. I also targeted the body, so when you create a shrink wrap modifier, this is what it would look like. You just click over here, click on the body, and it will target it. Next, I changed this over here to above surface. I can't remember the original one. I think it's on surface. Anyway, so I just put it above surface so it stays over the body and doesn't really go inside. And then I added a solidify modifier. And this is basically just to add some thickness to the bats. And that's pretty much it. As for the rest of the sculpt, it's pretty much raw practice, anatomy knowledge, and all of that good stuff. Now, I don't have an anatomy course on the channel yet. I'll have one in 2019, but if you're new to the channel, I have a beginner tutorial on sculpting in Blender and even Blender 2.8. So if you missed it out, go check it out, learn how to sculpt, have fun. But for now, let's talk about the texturing. To avoid any confusion, this is actually Blender 2.8. I am using the render engine EEVEE. Now the methods I'll show you for texturing and the nodes, they work with cycles and Blender 2.79 as well, so don't worry about that. Now when you open Blender 2.8, if you're following it in the same way, it might be a bit different for you depending on the version of 2.8 that you have, but basically up over here, for me, the third one is where I can start shading the character, and there are built-in HDRIs. This is pretty awesome. So that's what I'm going to be using to show you how to do this, but you can simply, let me just put this back over here, go from the modeling workspace to the shading one, and everything is set up for you. Now, if you have the same issue as I do over here and the textures are not showing right now, you can basically just grab the object, tab to go to edit mode, go back out, and it will refresh. And we can do the same thing for the darkness over here that we have with the eyes. So I'm just gonna grab it, edit, and there you go. So just a really quick thing before I get to the texturing. Also in Blender EEVEE, with the shading area over here, you can basically play around with the background, so you can remove it or add it. You can also play around with the rotation of the HDRI, which is pretty awesome, and you can play around obviously with the types. And that's pretty much the basics of shading in Blender 2.8. Okay, so let's start talking about the texturing. First things first, I will tackle the mask because a lot of you guys wanted to know how I did it. It's actually quite simple, and it's pretty much the same for the cape, body, and logo, at least the same method. But before we start texturing, here is what I want you to do. I want you to go to Edit, User Preferences. If you're using Blender 2.79, it will be in the file, not on Edit. But anyways, once you open this, make sure that you go to Add-ons and that you activate the Node Wrangler. Already talked about it in another video, but basically it's so that we can do some of the manipulations that I'll show you. So for the mask, it's actually a mix of diffuse and cavity with some normal bump map and spec map. You know, once you get all of these together, you get this really nice grunge look with, you know, a lot of spec, a lot of bump, and it's looking pretty good. All right, so let's just go right here and see what's going on. So first things first, we have the diffuse socket, so the base color. For the base color, I basically added, you know, a color over here, so a dark one, and this is basically just an RGB node that you can get with Shift A, search RGB, and there you go, that's the one, okay? And as for the cavity looks like this. So over here, you'll notice that it's an image. I actually baked it from Blender 2.79 because right now with the current version of EEVEE I'm using, I can't recreate it with the nodal setup. So this is what it looks like. It took some time to actually show, but basically this is a geometry node. So geometry over here, and it's the pointiness right over here. So once you add, for example, let's see, if you Control Shift and click on the node, it will show you each and one of them. And right here with Blender EEVEE, you can see that nothing's really going on. So I had to bake it from Blender 2.79. Now I'll show you in a second how to do it from Blender 2.79, but maybe by the time you watch this video, you can already use the nodes to get it. Anyways, moving on, once I baked it, I imported it to Blender 2.8 over here. Now to get these three nodes together really fast, you can just click on, for example, the ramp over here, or any node. You can even click on this node and hit Control T. Now this will only work if you have the Node Wrangler add-on activated. Anyways, I will delete it right now. And once you do that, I just use the UV socket because, you know, I unwrapped the mask, and then I basically went over here and just imported the cavity image. And then I created a color ramp. So the reason I created this is so that I can basically just control the difference between the black, the darker, and the brightness, the brighter values. So once that was done, I added a mix RGB. So this is Shift A, search, RGB, and it's the second one, so mix RGB. And then I changed from mix to add, to basically add the whites to this color. So once you do that, if we take a look at the cavity and then with this node, that's what it looks like. And then I added a hue saturation value. Again, just always Shift A and just search for the name, you'll find it. And once I did that, I just basically added it to control the value over here. So the brightness, and then I added it to the base color. Okay, as for the rest, let's take a look what the mask looks like without them. So if I remove both of these over here, we're gonna notice that we don't have bump and the speck is not really looking as good. It's uniform all over. So to get the look that I went for, basically I created a bump node. So this is Shift A, again, search bump, this one. And I imported over here a grunge texture. This is what it looks like, and I got this from textures.com. You can find the textures over there. They have a lot of grunge textures, so it's always a nice addition to materials like this. I also made sure that I changed the texture coordinate to object because you know, you just try to check out each and one of them and see the difference. For me, the object one worked the best. I wanted to get a really quick look without having to work it and work the texture for it to look good. I just wanted to get it done. So this is a quick and dirty way to do it. And I changed this to box and blended the texture a bit so that we don't see the seams and it looks like it's a proper texture. Okay. So once I did that, I made sure to change to non-color data because we need just the blacks and whites for the bump map over here. There you go. So I have a color ramp to also control later on the values of black and whites. And you can basically just grab this and then change here the values. And that will basically change how much bump you got. So once you do that, you enter this value to the height and you play around with the strength, and you can also invert the bump and see what works best with your character. So over here, you can see that's what the bump looks like. I could always increase it and you'll see what it looks like then. See, that's a bit too much and then that's too little. So I'll just put it back to the value I chose. You can also play around with the distance. You'll see the kind of effect it gives. 0.1 worked pretty well for me. And then I added this to the principled shader over here. So let's go to normal over here. There you go. And there you go. We got the bump. Now to control the spec map, it's quite similar. So again, I use this texture for the bump, the grunge map, and I added a second one over here, so a different texture. And I added a ramp again to be able to control the values later on. And then I added a mix RGB. So this is again Shift A, search mix RGB. So it's this one. And I changed mix to multiply so that it can multiply the dark values. And if you take a look over here, this is what the texture looks like. And when I mix it with the first one, the one I used for the bump, we basically get a bit more darkness over here so that wherever there are creases on the mask, you don't see any speck. Anyways, and then I added a ramp again to control the speck. And I basically added this to the roughness. There you go. It will take a minute to show. And that's what it looks like. Now I actually believe I added it to the specular. Let's see. Yep, to the specular. So the difference between adding it to the specular and roughness is basically the roughness, it'll take into account the darker values, and that's where it'll add the spec. And for the specular, it'll do the opposite. So basically it's adding spec to the brighter values. I'm going to quickly show you how to bake the cavity map with Cycles Render and Blender 2.79. Now, later on, you'll be able to do it in Blender 2.8, but if you still can't like I do, then you can do it this way. So just grab the mask over here or whatever object you're trying to bake the cavity from, create a geometry node, so Shift A, search geometry, and use the pointiness with a ramp. So let me show you what this looks like. So if I hit Control B just to see this area and render it, so Shift Z, there you go. And then I Control Shift over here and I go down till I go to pointiness. You won't really see any difference over here. We need to play around with the values. So when you create with Shift A ramp node, color ramp over here, you can just connect pointiness to FAC and then Control Shift on color ramp. And I basically pushed the darker and white values closer to each other to be able to see the cavity. Now you'll notice over here there is a white spot. I cleaned it up later on after I baked the texture. But for now, let me show you how to bake it. So to bake a texture, it's actually quite simple, but make sure you don't miss any of these steps so that it works properly. We will Shift A over here, search image texture. We're gonna put it aside and we will create a new texture over here. So new, just choose the dimensions that you want. I'm gonna leave it at 1K. I'm gonna call it cavity tutorial. There you go. Perfect. And then I will come over here and look for cavity tutorial, and we will get back to that in a second. You also want to create an emission node, so Shift A, search emission, and put it right here. And we're basically going to bake this. So if I go to rendering over here, this is the color ramp and this is what the emission will look like. And the really cool thing about the emission is because of the way the node works, the samples won't matter. So even if you have a low number of samples, render samples over here, we're gonna put it at 100. It won't change the quality of the texture. So when you go to renders properties over here, you're gonna go down and you're gonna find a bake section. You want to change the bake type to emit for emission. So I will bake this over here. And you want to make sure that you select the image texture, but you don't select it with Control Shift. So you're not doing that. The Control Shift is over here. So I'll basically bake this and you select this so that it takes this texture into account. I found that doing this, make sure it always works. So anyways, once you do that, you will basically bake it. Make sure that you have the right margin. If you don't know what margin is, basically depending on the UV mapping that you have, this will bleed out from the seams. So the bigger it is, the less likely you will see the seams unless your islands are too close. So if I go to edit mode over here and I get close over here, you're gonna see that the islands for the unwrapping for me, it's far enough, and I did it on purpose so that I can add a margin and so that we don't see seams later on. Anyways, so once you're done, just hit bake and it should do it in a second. You can see over here it's baking. And there you go, we have the cavity map. Once you're done, just image, save as, and you have your map. As for the skin, it's a bit more complicated than the mask. I won't be explaining the details over here, it would take a while, but I basically have an in-depth course on my Gumroad and a trailer on the channel. I'll add a link in the description below, you can check it out. I basically use the same methods that I teach over there to create the skin for Batman. But what I do want to show you right now is that when you are rendering anything with subsurface scattering and Blender EEVEE, so Blender 2.8, make sure you go to the rendering properties over here. You go down and you check the subsurface scattering. Also check the screen space reflections and the ambient occlusion. And once you do that, for the material that you're going to add subsurface scattering, before you add the subsurface scattering in the principal shader over here, you can basically go down over here and check these two checkboxes. Once you check them, you can start adding the subsurface on the principal shader. Hope you guys enjoyed the video, learned a thing or two. If you have any questions, leave a comment in the comment section below. Also, don't forget to share and like the video. By the way, next week, well, technically this week when you're watching it, so it's the 15th of October, I'm gonna teach at a university. So I'll be a bit busy this week. I'm not sure I'll be able to make a video for next week, but I'll do my best. So if you guys have anything in particular you want to learn for this week, give me your ideas down below. And if I find anything that is simple enough that I can do in a weekend and both enjoyable to me and a learning experience to you guys, I'll try to make it. So yeah, anyways, see you guys soon. Make sure to subscribe to the channel for more awesome character sculpts and art related videos. You can also check out my store for full courses on character sculpting, texturing, materials, brushes, and more. Last but not least, if you enjoyed this video, then you will definitely enjoy the next one.